Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's start. First of all, do you know something about code style guides? What they are? Why do we need it? So let's move to definition. Style guide is a physical or digital document that represents the styles, patterns, practices, and principles of a company or brand and teaches how to use it. Why we have code standards and style guides? Most developers have their own way of doing things, which may be fine for small standalone projects, but within an enterprise level project, this can lead to issues such as inconsistent code in terms of organization, syntax, formatting, and naming conventions, code bloat in production systems, often including code that is either never used or is out of date, multiple implementations of functionality with the consequential maintenance overload due to multiple chunks of code that solve the same problem in different ways, and an inconsistent look and feel due to multiple implementations of similar features. Also, it could lead to bugs and typos, uncommented or poorly documented code, unreadable code, code from one side linked to from other sides that is updated at source runs the risk of breaking features implemented elsewhere. So if core standards and style guides are good, why are we getting them just now? Uh, It's costly in terms of time and effort to figure out what these guidelines should be and get them documented, even if you are adapting ones that are available from the programming world at large. In addition to this, we have got the task of getting a consensus among developers on which particular style to use. It's a bit like asking art students who their favorite Renaissance painter is. You will get many passionate answers that are all probably great answers, but the trouble is that you have got to choose just one. So today we are going to. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Before we start, I'd like to say that all information according to this presentation and this style guide, it's not ultimate truth. It's just recommendations which will make your code more readable and understandable. So let's talk about history. Airbnb is an American company that operates an online marketplace for lodging, primarily homestays for vacation rentals and tourism activities based in San Francisco, California. That the platform is accessible via website and mobile app. And this company created one of the most useful and popular ways to style your code. So let's talk about rules. As you know, in core JavaScript, there are 7 primitive types of data. When you access a primitive type, you work directly on its value. So, like in this example. Also, we have another complex type object. When you access a complex type, you work on a reference to its value. Like in this example. And let's continue. References. The first, the best practice is to use const for all of your references. Avoid using var. because it ensures that you can't reassign your references, which can lead to bugs and difficult to comprehend code. So in this example, we have a way which is the bad practice because we defined variable a and b using var, and this variables const because we're using object and array. Let's move to object. The first recommendation is to use the literal syntax for object creation, like in this example. Also, it's good to use computed property names when creating objects with dynamic property names because it allows you to define all the properties of an object in one place. So, like in this example. Another recommendation is to use object method shorthand. You could see that we have object atom and method at value. In the last variant, we could make a shorter rather than in first. So another recommendation is to group your shorthand properties at the beginning of your object declaration. Because it's easier to tell which properties are using the shorthand. So you could see that there are two groups of properties in last variant. It's also good to only quote properties that are invalid identifiers. In general, we consider it subjectively easier to read. It improves syntax highlighting and is also more easily optimized by many JavaScript engines. So we have an example of bad practice. The property foo and bar you should define without any quotes. But for the third property, we should type quotes. Another recommendation is prefer the object spread syntax over object assign to shallow copy objects. Use the object rest operator to get a new object with certain properties omitted. You could see that the last variant is more readable and easy to understand to other developers. So let's move to arrays. The first recommendation is to use literal syntax for array creation. As you remember, like in object creation. Another rule is to use array push instead of direct assignment to add items to an array. Also, like in objects, best practice is to use array spread syntax to copy arrays. Like in this example, we don't need this cycle because in this example we are doing a lot of operations. Instead of this, we could use spread syntax. Another recommendation is to use array from for converting an array like object to an array. So array from is a method which could have a property have a property just iterable. So like object or string and so on. Destructuring. I don't know. Did you hear about what is this? Destructuring is a feature which appeared in JavaScript after ECMAScript the 6. This feature helps us to work with different properties in more shorter variant and readable variant. We have this example, the function getFullName. The property is user, which have two properties, first name and last name, and we created two constants with the first and last name, and then we returning it. But we, as you see, we could make it in more readable variant just using curly braces. Let's continue. Another recommendation is to use array destructuring like an object. So in this example, we have an array with 4 elements, and if you want to get access to the first 2 values of its array, we can implement destructuring like on the 8th string. So as a result of this expression, we will get 2 constants named first and second with these values. Also, it's good to use object destructuring for multiple return values, not array destructuring. So we have functions here, and in the first 2 variants, we returning an array, but best practice is to return an object with such properties. And using destructuring, we could get access to such properties we need. Let's move to strings. The first recommendation for strings is to use single quotes for it, because using double quotes often connected with different HTML templates or modules. Let's continue. Another recommendation, string that causes the line to go over 100 characters shouldn't be written across multiple lines using string concatenation. I'm sorry. So here we have examples of recommendations how which are bad, and another long string. Let's continue. Also, it's good practice when using pragmatically building up strings, use template strings instead of concatenation. Maybe you know template strings. It's another JavaScript feature which appeared also after ECMAScript. This using this syntax dollar and symbol of dollar and curly braces and single quotes, we could get access to variable inside the template string. Functions. So the first recommendation is never declare a function in a non-function block. For example, if, while, and so on. Assign the function to a variable instead. Browsers will allow you to do it, but they all interpret it differently. which is bad news bears. It also could lead to different bugs and unexpected behavior. Another recommendation is never name parameter arguments. This will take reference over the arguments object that is given to every function scope. So as you know, every function just function which created with the use function declaration, like in this example, has default parameter arguments, and it's a reserved name. So it's bad to use it. And let's continue. Another recommendation is never to use arguments to use a REST syntax of 3 dots instead, like in this example. I'm sorry. This example is an old way to use arguments. This example is more convenient and more readable. Another recommendation, use default parameter syntax rather than mutating function arguments. So here we have 3 functions and which have property opts, and in first variant we mutating it, and the second variant also mutating it. The best practice when you work with function properties and you should mutate something, just return a copy of it. It's the best practice. Or use default parameter. Let's continue. Another recommendation is avoid side effects with default parameters. So here we have a variable b, and in this example, function count mutating this variable. As a result, when we call this function many times, we getting not the same result. We getting different values. It's rather bad practice, and never use it. Another recommendation, always put default parameters last. It's just for code readability, and it helps another developers to understand your code easier. Also, it's good practice, never use a function constructor to create a new function. Because creating a function in its way evaluates a string similarity to evil, which open vulnerabilities, and also it could lead to problems with security in your application. Another recommendation, spacing in a function signature. So when we creating functions, it's a good practice to leave one space before round braces and one space before curly braces. Let's continue. Other recommendation is never mutate parameters. I told it before, but in this example, we getting just a little part of this object, and also when you need to return object from a function, you could create a copy of this object or an array. Also it's good practice never reassign parameters, because reassigning parameters can lead to unexpected behavior especially when accessing the arguments object. It can also cause optimization issues, especially in V8. V8 is a JavaScript engine which are inside which is inside Google Chrome. Let's move to arrow functions. Arrow functions also appeared after ECMAScript 6, and in case the expression spans over multiple lines, wrap it in pathiness for better readability. It shows clearly where the function starts and ends. So here we have an example. And it's good practice to when we have a huge body of our function, we could move the body to the next lines. Let's continue. Avoid confusing arrow function syntax with comparison operators. So here we have 3 bad examples with using these comparison operators, and it provides better readability of your code. The best way is that you could move your value or function body to the next lines. Another recommendation is enforce the allocation of arrow function bodies with implicit returns. I think in this example, everything is clear. When you return just one value and or you have a small function body, you don't need to move it to the next line. Let's move to classes and constructors. The first recommendation is always use class. Avoid manipulating prototype directly because it's also could lead to problems with method instance of, and also it could lead to some unexpected behavior. Just use class. Use extends for inheritance. It's a built-in way to inherit prototype functionality without breaking instance of. And also it's more readable and understandable way to show what class extends from another class. Let's continue. Another recommendation, it's okay to write a custom toString method. Just make sure it works successfully and causes no side effects. As you know, toString method have some types, some types in JavaScript may have this method toString, and in different ways it could works differently, and also it's not a bad practice to use your custom method toString. Another recommendation is to avoid duplicate class members. Duplicate class member declarations will silently prefer the last one. Having duplicates is almost certainly a bug. This recommendation is also connected with variables. Never duplicate your variables names. Let's move to modules. I suppose that you don't know what modules are. I guess you will learn it in future units. during your studying at Rolling Scope School, I tried to explain you. So, for example, we have a big application which required a lot of features, and to group some features, we could create different JavaScript files, and using syntax import and export, we could move these features to our main.js file. So when you will learn what modules are, you could return to this presentation and remind your knowledge. The first example, bad example with the use require, it's an old practice. The best way today is to use import syntax and export default syntax. Let's continue. Another recommendation is don't use wildcard imports. In this example, using this syntax, we will import everything from Airbnb style guide, but we need just Airbnb style guide, just one class, object, or something else. We don't need import everything, all from this file. We could get access to just one feature, function, and so on. This makes sure you have a single default export. Another good practice is to only import from a path in one place. Having multiple lines that import from the same path can make code harder to maintain. So here we have example with different different functions, something else which we imported from file named foo, and we did it in separate lines, and we using import 3 times. It's a bad practice because we could do it with just one import. So like in this example. Let's continue. Another good practice is don't export mutable bindings. Mutation should be avoided in general, but in particular when exporting I'm sorry, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
I have, thanks. I have problems with internet connection. So let's continue. Another best practice is don't export mutable bindings. Mutation should be avoided in general, but in particular when exporting mutable bindings. While this technique may be needed for some special cases, in general, only constant references should be exported. Never export some variables which declared with the use of let or var. It's a bad practice. Another recommendation: in modules with a single export, prefer default export over named export. To encourage more files that only ever export one thing, which is better for readability and maintainability. Let's continue. Also, it's good to put all imports above non-import statements. Since imports are hoisted, keeping them all at the top prevents surprising behavior, and also it provides good readability, and another developer will easier understand your code. Another rule is don't include JavaScript file name extensions. Including extensions inhibits refactoring, and inappropriately hard-codes implementation details of the module you're importing in every consumer. Let's continue. Iterators and generators. Don't use iterators, prefer JavaScript's higher order functions instead of loops like for in or for off. These cycles are not required because we have methods. For example, in this way, we have array numbers and we have methods for each. We don't need to use cycle because JavaScript engine makes more operations to run this cycle. Just use methods instead of for in or for off. Here we have another example of using methods instead of cycles. Some motivation for you. Let's continue. Properties. The first recommendation for properties, don't notation when accessing properties. So we don't need this syntax because this property isn't complex, and this property is right. We need just this syntax. It's a good practice. Another bracket notation when accessing properties with a variable. Like in this example. Also, good practice, use exponentation operator syntax when calculating exponentations. In this example, we don't need use global object math and call its method pow. We just could do it with the help of this operator. Let's move to variables. Always use const or let to declare variables. Not doing so will result in global variables. We want to avoid polluting the global namespace. So I try to explain you what is happening. For example, when we defined a variable named a, we created an property for global object window, and this variable and we could access this variable from anywhere. For example, So without using special words, var, let, or const, we declared a like property for global object window. It's a rather bad practice. The best way is using special syntax, let or const. We get undefined because window doesn't have this property. So let's continue. Here we have example. When you create variables, try always to use const or let. Another recommendation is to group all your consts and then group all your lets. It provides good code readability and helps another people understand your code. Don't chain variable assignments. Chain variable assignments creates implicit global variables. 2 minutes ago, I showed you how it works. So in this example, we defined variable a with the use of let, but variables b and c will create properties for global object window. As a result, we could get access for these variables without errors outside the scope of this function. So, like in this, we declared a with the use of let, and we declared b and c without any special word, and so that is why we have values. The right way is to define all your variables with the use of special words. Another good practice is to avoid line breaks before or after in an assignment. If your assignment violates maxlen, surround the value in parents. So you could see these two examples is the best way. Let's continue. Hoisting. Guys, do you know what is hoisting at all? Do you hear about it?
Yes, it was mentioned in previous lecture.
Oh,
like
that's
moving
great.
up.
That's nice. I also will leave you some articles what is hoisting in JavaScript at the end of this lecture in useful links. Let's continue. The first recommendation, var declarations get hoisted to the top of their closest enclosing function scope. Their assignment doesn't. Const and let declaration are blessed with a new concept called temporal dead zones. It's important to know why typeof is no longer safe. So in this example, in the first example, we're trying to call console log with variable which is not defined. So as a result, we're getting a reference error. When we using var, we get undefined. Here we have another example. We're using let and const. Another good practice is anonymous function expressions hoist their variable name, but not the function assignment. So if we declared function, if you want to create anonymous function with which declared with var or let, oh no, just var. So as a result, here we have undefined. If we will use let, we will get a error. Let's continue. Named function expressions hoist the variable name, not the function name or the function body. The same examples like in previous. And also function declarations hoist their name and their function body. So you could see that we could call a function named superpower before its function declare. Let's move to comparison operators and equality. As you know, there are two types of comparison operators with this syntax. Conditional statements such as the if statement evaluate their expression using version with the to Boolean abstract method and always follow these simple rules. You probably know these rules. Object evaluate to true, undefined evaluates to false, null evaluates to false, Booleans evaluates to the value of the Boolean, numbers evaluate to false if plus null, minus plus 0, minus 0, or not a number, otherwise true. And strings evaluate to false if an empty string. So here we have example, and we have an empty array, and we have an array with 0. These two values are equal. They are false, both. So as a result, we are getting true. Another good practice is to use shortcuts for booleans, but explicit comparisons for strings and numbers. So here we have two examples. 6 examples. If we are using boolean, it's good practice to use a short variant. If we're using another value, try to use operators. Ternaries should not be nested and generally be single line expression, like in this example. But if you have a lot of conditions for ternaries, you could move your code to another lines. Another recommendation, avoid unneeded ternary statements. I think everything is clear on these examples. Let's move to blocks. The first recommendation is to use braces with all multi-line blocks. Using curly braces is good practice. Another recommendation, if you are using multi-line blocks with if and else, put else on the same line as your if blocks closing brace. like in this example. Let's continue. If an if block always executes a return statement, the subsequent else block is unnecessary. A turn an else if block following an if block that contains a return can be separated into multiple if blocks. So we have examples of bad practice. Here, for example, we have function which return x in case of success, but we don't need using else. We could just return x after this if block, like in this example. Let's move to control statements. In case your control statements, while and so on, gets too long or exceeds the line length, each condition could be put into a new line to the line. So here we have example with lots of statements. And these two examples are also bad examples. And here we have good examples how to make it more understandable and readable. So another recommendation is don't use selection operators in place of control statements. So in this example, we have a bad practice because we calling this function using selection operator, and instead of it use just default blocks if. Okay, let's move to comments. If you want to add a multi-line comment, you could use this syntax. So as you see, you don't need to use this syntax for single line comments. Use // for single line comments. Place single line comments on a new line above the sub of the comment, and also put an empty line before the comment unless it's on the first line of a block, like in these examples. Another good recommendation is to start all comments with a space to make it easier to read. So after this syntax, it's good practice to leave one space. It provides good code readability. White space. Use soft tabs set to two spaces. But it's not ultimate truth. It depends on the project you will work on. For example, different projects have their different ways to code styling, and for example, this way might be good for any project or company. So that is why it's not ultimate truth. place one space before the leading brace. So here we have examples. Before curling braces, always try to leave one space. Also, it's good place one space before the opening parenthesis in control statements. If, while, and so on. Place no space between the argument list and the function name is function calls and declarations. So if we are working with blocks, try to leave one space after if. And when you are working with functions, try to always leave one space after function and after function name and after round bracers. Another recommendation is to set off operators with spaces. I think everything is clear on this example. Another good practice, end files with a single new line character. So here we have an example. The first example, we didn't leave any empty line at the end of our document. In this, we have symbol, which means put to another line, and we have two symbols. It depends on your IDE settings. Just tap one enter after the last line of your file, and it will be enough for it. The third example is right. Let's continue. Another good recommendation to do not add spaces inside parentheses. Example. Let's continue. Also, it's good to don't add spaces inside brackets. So like this, it's and like this. Another good practice is require consistent spacing inside an open block token and the next token on the same line. This rule also enforces consistent spacing inside a closed block token and previous token on the same line. So here we have example, bad example, and here we leave one space after the first curly brace and before the last curly brace. Another recommendation is to avoid spaces before commas and require a space after commas. So when you're using comma, just forget about spacing before. Just leave one space after comma. Another good practice is to enforce spacing inside of computed property brackets. So here we have an example. It's bad practice to leave spaces in brackets, but if we are using curly brace, it's good. Also, it's good to avoid spaces between functions and their invocations. Another recommendation is to enforce spacing between keys and values in object literal properties. So always leave one space after key, and also leave space in curly brace after the first and before the second. Let's move to commas. I'd like to say that so here we have bad examples and just one good example. When you working with objects and or arrays, don't mind. You have you might have rather long objects or arrays, and it's good practice to leave comma at the end of line, not at the beginning, like in these examples. Also try to use additional trailing comma. Here we have two examples, and you could see that there is no property after inventor of, but we have comma here. This leads to cleaner git diffs. Also, transpiles like Babel will remove the additional trailing comma in the transpiled code, which means you don't have to worry about the trailing comma problem in legacy browser. Let's move to semicolons. When JavaScript encounters a line break without a semicolon, it uses a set of rules called automatic semicolon insertion to determine whether it should regard that line break as the end of a statement and place a semicolon into your code before the line break if it thinks so. ACI contains a few eccentric behaviors, so and your code will break if JavaScript misinterprets your line break. These rules will become complicated as new features become a part of JavaScript. Explicitly terminating your statements and configuring your linter to catch missing semicolons because it will help prevent you from encountering issues. So in this slide, we have just bad examples. There is no one semicolon here. Let's move next. Here we have semicolons after every variable declaration, after calling methods, and after functional return statements. Let's move to naming conventions. So the first recommendation is to avoid single letter names. Be descriptive with your naming. Here we have rather bad example, and it's a good practice to name your variables, functions, methods, properties, and so on according to what are they doing, what are they consist. So another recommendation is to use camel case when naming objects, functions, and instances. So here we have example. The first word should be start with lowercase, and every next word should have one big letter, one big symbol. It provides a good readability. Let's continue. Another recommendation is to use Pascal case only when naming constructors or classes. So if you want to create some class, just use Pascal case. It means that your name should start with uppercase letter, uppercase symbol, and every next new word inside of this name also should start with uppercase symbol. It helps our define functions, classes, and everything in JavaScript. Another recommendation, a base file name should exactly match the name of its default export. So here we have just bad examples. And here we have examples of good practice. So the name of something we imported should be the same as the file. Another good practice is to use camel case when you export default a function. Your file name should be identical to your function's name, like in this example. Another recommendation is to use Pascal case when you export a constructor, class, module, function library, where object. Also, I told you that it helps us to define what are we imported. So using these name conventions like Pascal case, camel case, and so on, we know at the import level what is that? Is it class or is it function? Something in this way. Another good practice, acronyms in initialisms should always be all uppercase or all lowercase. So here we have acronyms, and it's good practice to uppercase all acronyms or lowercase. It also provides good readability and makes your code understandable for another people. Accessors. Accessor functions for properties are not required. Good practice is to don't use JavaScript getters, setters, as they cause unexpected side effects and they are harder to test, maintain, and reason about. Instead, if you do make accessor functions, use get value and set value. just use these words in method name or property name. Don't use this syntax. So here we have example of bad practice. We created getter and setter for age, which also could call another side effects. But good practice is to just describe in these names what are they really doing. Another recommendation is if the property or method is a boolean, use is value, for example, or has value. This recommendation works only for boolean values or describing what this method or property doing. Also, it's okay to create get and set functions, but be consistent. So here we have an example. We don't use special syntax. We don't create getter and setter. We created just simple methods set and get, and these methods could guess properties and doing something with properties of these methods. Also, by the end of our lecture, I leave you useful links. Here we have the first link is a link to Airbnb documentation. By going by this link, you could find all the full rules of this style guide. Another link, it's a link to how to install Airbnb with Node Package Manager. Don't scare, you will learn what is NPM in future units according to Rolling Scope School, and also you will learn what is project building tools like Webpack or Gulp. And also the third link is an article from medium.com. In this article, you could find how to set up ESLint with Airbnb base, and also in this article describes how to use Node Package Manager and some commands to Webpack, but you might not read just now. You could read these articles after modules which connected with Node Package Manager or Webpack. Also, I leave article which connected with hoisting process in JavaScript. Also, it helps you to better understand what hoisting is. And destructuring in JavaScript, another feature. And there is another article how it works, and there also are some examples of destructuring. That's all for today. Thank you for attention. Do you have any questions for me?
Seems everything was clear. Sergey, thank you a lot. The lecture was great.
Thanks. Have a nice evening. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.